Good evening. These are very serious and difficult times. On behalf of the National Council of Negro Women, I'm Janice Mathis, and it's my honor to welcome you to this webinar, Coping with COVID-19. Who could ever have imagined that we would be in such a place as this even 6 months ago? But nothing in life is certain, except that change is perpetual. And we, as women and men of faith and courage and great heritage, are called upon to meet the times that we are dealt. And so this evening, we want to explore what COVID-19 means to us. We'll get started with the program in just a minute. People are continuing to sign in. I do want to say to you that NCNW presents these webinars as part of our mission to lead, advocate for, and empower women of African descent, their families and communities every second and fourth Thursday evenings from 7 to 8:30. They're free of charge. We certainly hope that you will consider joining the National Council of Negro Women. But we are not in this to make money. We're in it to change hearts and minds. Mr. Johannes, who is our communications director, will come on now to give you some tips and some direction about use of the technology if you're not familiar with GoToWebinar. Mr. Johannes.
Good evening. If you would notice, you have a menu to the right of your screen, starting with an orange arrow. Down at the bottom is a pin that you can write a question and it will turn into a hand. Once you put the question in, we will be able to talk to our panelists and tell them. Also, if you look down on that same panel, there is a drop down called handouts, where you have information on how to use GoToWebinar, as well as the PowerPoint in a PDF format for tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Johannes. As our guests continue to log into the webinar this evening, I must say that I did not really have this topic at the top of my mind a week ago. But someone called me and said, Sister ED, I need you to write and think about what's going on with health disparities in this COVID-19. As I usually do, I say, yes, ma'am, I will do that. And I just start fiddling around on the internet and looking. And of course, we've known for decades that there are serious health disparities between African Americans and our other fellow Americans. In the area of hypertension, we're twice as likely to get it. But the more I read, the more incensed I became. In corporate America, there's a saying, what gets measured gets done. And what I found was we were measuring the disparity in COVID-19 and Black health and lives, but it was not being well reported. You probably have guessed by now that the person who called me and said, Sister ED, that's what Dr. Janetta Cole calls me, Sister ED. And I refer to her as Dr. C. But she's more than that. Of course, she's an iconic presence in American life. I've been privileged to travel with her some now for more than a year. And everywhere we go, the reaction is the same. It doesn't matter if the people are Black, white, African, European, whether we're in Florida, at the Rose Parade in California, the reaction is the same, one of deep admiration and respect. And so it's my privilege this evening to introduce the only there are only 2 HBCUs for women in the United States. One is in Greensboro, North Carolina, and it's called Bennett College. The other is in Atlanta, Georgia, and is known as Spelman. And she's presided over both of them. And in her spare time, she directed the Smithsonian Museum of African Art. A mighty woman, a warrior, Black to her heart, got an African proverb for everything. My boss, my mentor, my friend, Dr. Janetta Cole.
Sister ED, I am giving you a virtual hug. I am also giving a virtual hug to all on this webinar as participants, and certainly to my sisters and brothers. You know, I can't go another minute without acknowledging that extraordinary force of activism that I call Sister President Melanie Gamble. And I'm so pleased to be on this webinar with two brothers, righteous brothers, in the struggle for our ultimate liberation. Robert Patillo, it's wonderful to be with you. Daryl Parks, it's just a joy to be with you. And as I will say later, I am also here with two NCNW brothers. So good evening to all. I want to begin with expressing my gratitude to Sister Edie, because she has this ability to sense what is of utmost importance in our community, and then to find ways to turn that into programs, into actions. And so I have no doubt that she's going to be on this question now of COVID-19 as the most horrific expression of a health disparity. She's going to be on it like white on rice, or in the interest of diversity, I would say like black on coal. Now, let me say just a few things to kind of get us started with this discussion. And then we, of course, will open up to hear you, my sisters and my righteous brothers all. When I grew up in the state that I am in now called Florida, the old folk who grew me up had a saying, and I can't think of a better way of introducing this to you. They would say this, you know, when white folks got a cold, black folk got walking pneumonia. Now that's a very folksy way of saying what we're wrestling with and what we're going to discuss in this webinar. When white folks got a cold, black folks got walking pneumonia, which is to say that we as Black Americans are dying from COVID-19 at a far faster pace than most other Americans. This is the kind of reality that screams of long-standing patterns of systemic racism. Yes, anybody can be attacked by this coronavirus. Yes, anybody can get sick from it. Anybody can pass away and go to glory as a result. But why should Black people be attacked more often, get sick at a higher rate, and die with greater frequency? The New York Times reports that there are three basic factors setting you up for this COVID-19 to attack and possibly to take your life. The first, of course, is old age. Now, I gotta tell you, my sisters and brothers, that doesn't feel very good to me. The second is a pre-existing health condition. But the third is your socioeconomic status. And we African Americans are disproportionately in that category. I want to share just a couple of statistics with you, because I do think that facts matter. In the state of Michigan, 14% of the population identify as Black. But Black people account for 40% of the 19 deaths. In the state of Illinois, African Americans make up 14.6% of the population, but African Americans are 28% of the confirmed cases of COVID-19. Let me compare that now with white Americans. White Americans in Illinois make up 76.9% of the population, but only 39% of the confirmed cases of the coronavirus. These stats, these statistics reflect what has been a long, long history and her story of health disparities. NCNW is fully aware of this. That is why one of our four foci of our programmatic work focuses on health disparities experienced by Black women. Now, my sisters and my brothers, if you share our concern about the inequality that is reflected in health disparities, and if you share our concern, and for me, I have to use a strong word, my outrage over what is happening now with African Americans being disproportionately affected by this pandemic, and you want to support us in the work that we are doing around health disparities, and I assure you this determination we have now to address these disproportionate effects from the pandemic, then please join us. Go and visit ncmw.org. And if you can, make a donation, make a contribution that will help us to continue to address the inequities that affect the lives of Black women, our families, and our communities. Now, before I bring closure on my remarks, here's what I'd like to do. And it is to note that last November, NCNW named its associates. It's existed for a number of years. Who are the associates? Easily, accurately described, the righteous brothers who support the work of NCNW. And so last November, the associates were named for a very distinguished and beloved physician, Dr. Charles L. Franklin. So these menfolk, when they had their meeting, their first meeting after assuming very proudly their new name, they decided to focus on issues of health. Again, one of the four foci of our programmatic work. And so later in this webinar, you will hear from two very, 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 very righteous brothers who are associated with the Charles L. Franklin Associates. You'll hear from the co-chair of the associates, who is my husband, James David Staton Jr., and we call him JD. And you will hear from Randus Wallace, a brother who each and every day I pray for, because Randus is on the front lines of the pandemic. So thank you, Sister ED, for giving me this joy, really, of participating in this particular webinar. And I turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for setting the table for this discussion and for reminding me to unmute myself. We want to talk about what our objectives are this evening. If we could have the next slide, please, Mr. Johannes. We have several objectives that we want to try to at least begin to address. Certainly, we won't be able to meet all of these objectives in 1 hour program, but it does signify for NCNW and for all of us how seriously we take this issue. And I've gathered some of my very best and closest friends to help us work through it. Robert Patillo is a distinguished lawyer and commentator who you see sometimes on television, giving great commentary. He spends a lot of time on radio. We'll be talking to Robert later. Mr. Darrell Parks, esteemed civil rights lawyer, really not a Florida lawyer, but an activist to his heart, somebody I've known a long time as a student activist and has been fighting for the rights of others for decades now. And my sister beloved, when I think about Melody Mel, I think about the fact that we went to see Black Panther together. And if there's ever anything that symbolizes our friendship, I think it is that we both consider ourselves warrior princesses. And there's nobody I'd rather be in battle with. So I want to thank my 3 dear friends for being here. And we've got others who will be joining us later on. What are our objectives? On March the 11th, the World Health Organization made an announcement. COVID-19, coronavirus, was no longer just an epidemic. It had become a pandemic. Bells went off because we knew that meant a worldwide contagion that could not easily be stopped. There wasn't a whole lot of notice about the difference in the terminology, but we'll talk about the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. Dr. Cole has already brilliantly explained what health disparities are. They're not new, but what is remarkable is despite decades of observance of these phenomena, we still don't have the targeted research done with integrity to get at the root causes and do away with these disparities. And then there's a fancy term that I've learned fairly recently called the social determinants of health. We'll talk about what that is and how that relates to these disparities. How did we get here? And where do we go for help? And what can we do now? You know, earlier this week, Mr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, made a statement about the health disparities. And he admitted, he said, we've known about it for a long time, it's terrible. But then he concluded his remarks at the podium by saying, unfortunately, there is nothing we can do about it now. That was stunning. It was a stunning admission to me of the level of neglect that our people are subject to. There's nothing we can do about it. I respectfully disagree with Dr. Fauci, who is a global expert on pandemics, because I believe that there are many things that we can do, and we want to end up tonight by talking about those. But before I go any further, Mr. J.D. Staten has become a friend and a brother beloved over these past months. He is a former purchasing official for the city of the District of Columbia. He is an expert life coach and constant companion and bulwark for the force of nature known as Janetta Bench Cole. We want to welcome him to this discussion. I happened to be a fly sitting on the settee when they talked about what the mission of the CLFA would be. And they sort of went back and forth, and ultimately they came up with a description. that the men of NCNW, the righteous brothers of NCNW, would focus on those areas of health that lead to healthy families and healthy relationships, whether we're talking about the stress that leads to domestic violence, or whether we're talking about the issue that we're here to discuss tonight. That is what CLFA is committed to doing, is improving the health conditions mentally, physically, emotionally of families of African descent and our communities. Mr. JD, I want to introduce you now and ask you if you would come and talk to us about, from your heart, about this subject.
Well, thank you. Thank you. As Janetta would say, Sister ED, and thank you for inviting us to be a part of this webinar. I want to talk about why it matters to us with men in this COVID-19, the subject of men. It matters to us from the men because it involves our families, our children, and our community. That's why it matters to us. And the issue of role and gender in analyzing this pandemic is murky. You heard Janetta mention, or Dr. Cole mention in her comments of some stats that affecting Black Americans. So as far as men are concerned, the numbers are murky right now. We don't have the information we need, but I do know that what has been published is that in China, men are more likely to die of the coronavirus than women. 64% of deaths in China have been in men, according to figures from the China Center for Disease Control. Now, Italy, we've heard a lot about Italy. That was one of the hot spots, the hot spots in the beginning. According to Italy's Public Health Research Agency, 60% of the coronavirus and 70% of deaths in that country so far have been with men. The Italian study also reports that men with COVID-19 tend to be more seriously ill and more at risk of death than women. And according to Dr. Briggs, we've seen her on the news, the White House coronavirus task force coordinator, the fact that the mortality rate is twice as high among men in Italy as it is among women marks a concerning trend. And we certainly can agree with that, especially when it comes to Black America. Why is this virus attacking us and the impact of Black men? We're waiting to see those numbers. Dr. Briggs added that no age group or gender is immune, and that mild symptoms are not equivalent to immunity. So we have work to do, and as the CLF Associates, we will continue these dialogues. We'll continue the dialogue and talk about the impact of health disparities. We join the women of NCNW to address these issues. And again, thank you for the opportunity to make a few comments here from what we know is going on around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Staten, and we'll get more from you as we move through this discussion. You know, when you say that men are more susceptible, at least in Italy and in China, to death from COVID-19, it makes you ask the question, why? But think about what men do. Men are often emergency technicians. Men are firemen. Men are police. Men are on the front lines. Men are driving trucks to supply our grocery stores. It's not surprising with the jobs that they have that they are putting themselves sometimes more at risk in this circumstance. Our next guest is Randall Wallace, a dear friend of mine who is on the front lines of the pandemic every day. And I won't speak for him, but he is a life coach and CEO of a company called Mending Minds, where he works with folks who need constant supervision. Mr. Wallace.
Yes, good evening, everyone. As we touched on some basis that statistics, bottom line is making sure that you wash your hands, you take care of your hygiene as much as possible. Those are basic things that we should do all the time, but now we need to step it up. when I coming home, so that I don't give it to your family members. Shower, because again, I'm on the front lines. Those are basic things that we should be doing every day and just stepping up a little bit more.
And absolutely. And what about, I know that some of the clients that you work with have some developmental or disabilities that may be emotional or psychological in nature. And after being cooped up in our houses for months or weeks, all of us may be suffering from some stress. What are some coping mechanisms for dealing with the mental and emotional stress of illness?
But what we've done is created activities, puzzles, building model planes, model cars, taking walks around the block, because we are in a stated stay-at-home order from Washington, D.C. So it's important that we have activities that we fill the day with.
Absolutely, to have those activities. And of course, it's a 24/7 occupation. There is no respite from it. I mean, often I remember my father had Alzheimer's disease, and we might occasionally get a family member or church member or friend to come sit a while and give the family a little bit of a break. But when you're dealing with people who can't fully take care of themselves, and many of the programs are shut down, what effect does that have on those being cared for as well as the caregivers?
Well, we have to jump around and try to get overtime is tremendous right now. Pulling in people from our headquarters in Chicago to help out. What we have to do is we have to pull together as a team, like working overtime, making sure that we're healthy as well, taking our temperature, just being active as far as we can, is making sure that everyone is safe.
Well, thank you for that. Mr. Johannes, could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. What is a pandemic? Pandemic. Pan means total. And if you go from the Greek or the Latin, pan, all, Pan-American, a global outbreak of disease, start in China, but not going to stay in China. You're being futile if you try to call it the Chinese virus, because there is no such thing. A virus doesn't have any borders. It doesn't have any president or any Congress that's going to keep it confined to some shore. It's going everywhere that there is air. A global outbreak of disease happens when a new virus emerges. And what is the significance of it being new? There is no treatment. There is no antibody. There is no antidote. And it spreads between people over and over and over again, and there is no immunity. The virus that causes COVID-19 is infecting people and spreading easily. Cases have been detected in most countries worldwide, and community spread, we've heard that term, is being detected in a growing number of countries. South America is not exempt. The continent of Africa is not exempt. The Indian subcontinent is not exempt. Let's go to the next slide, please. We've talked about healthcare disparities. One definition is that it refers to the higher burden or incidence. You think about illnesses like kidney failure, hypertension, which are actually related to each other, diabetes. All of those carry a heavier weight on our people than they do on others. You know, one of the things that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, and there hasn't been too much research about as far as I can tell, what is the weight of racism? What does it cost an average Black American in terms of health outcomes? How much stress? How much of that high blood? Now, they want to tell us that it's all about the ham and the collard greens and stuff that we eat. But how much of it is being dismissed for not being as smart as you know that you are, or not getting the promotion that you know that you earned? What does that do to somebody's physical body? We know now that the physical and the emotional are closely connected to each other. So I'm not going to indulge in this blame the victim mentality that the health disparities are our fault. I don't believe that. Let's go, and we don't have the research to prove it either. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, there's also a health care disparity, and that's where we get into some interesting statistics. You know, the Affordable Care Act cut in half the number of uninsured African Americans between 2010 and 2016. We went from being about 20% uninsured to being about 10% uninsured as Black Americans during that short 6-year period of time. Unfortunately, that positive trend has been reversed, is being reversed, not fully reversed, but now African Americans are 50% more likely to be uninsured than our white neighbors, just since 2016. I will leave to your imagination because NCNW neither supports nor opposes candidates for partisan political office, but I will leave to your imagination why the trend is going now in the wrong way. Let's go to the next slide, please. At this point, there's something, and it's beautiful. I like this chart because it's all NCNW shades of purple, but it's more important than that. It's important because it tells us your health is a think of it as a basket of stuff. Some of it you're born with, some of it you acquire over a lifetime, some of it is produced by your environment. And we don't have a clear picture of where those elements in that basket, how they combine to create your health profile. We know it has a lot to do with economic stability. The more money you have, the less likely you are to be sick. Anecdotally, we saw some very wealthy people get tested pretty quick for COVID-19. We saw some very wealthy basketball players. They weren't white, but they got tested pretty quick. Money matters in the US health system. Neighborhood and physical environment, what kind of housing, what kind of transportation, what kind of public safety, what opportunities for recreation are there? And if I had created this chart, this came from the Kaiser Family Foundation, very reputable organization. But if I had created this chart, I would have put environmental injustice on this neighborhood and physical environment. That parish down in Louisiana that has a very high death rate also has a very high rate of pollution in the water and the air and the soil. We talk about the environment, oh, you know, we're gonna let the white folk take care of the environment. We're gonna have to start taking care of the environment because if we don't, it's making us sick. If you look at Cancer Alley, Melanie's gonna talk about this a little bit later on. The black belt that runs from the Atlantic Ocean down to the Gulf of Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico, is some of the most polluted land and water and air in the United States because of the petrochemical industry. But that's where most Black folk live. Education matters. The more you know, the better able you are to protect yourself. Food, of course. Community and social context matters. All of these factors come together to create our individual and community health profiles. Let's move ahead, Mr. Johannes. And I think what we should do now, we've been talking now for about 30 minutes. I want to give our audience members an opportunity to weigh in with your opinions, your questions, and panelists. I hope you will be willing to take some questions at this point as well. If we have any questions.
We currently don't
Or
have any
comments.
questions. We have 2 comments to say thank you for doing this webinar.
Is that all?
That is all at this particular time.
Okay. Well, then we will continue to move ahead. Let's ask the audience a question since they don't have any for us. I have a question for the audience. How are you coping with this pandemic? Where are you finding solace? What are you doing to keep body and soul together? Are you suffering financially? Is it mostly emotional? Are you able to sleep well at night? Let's open up the microphone and see if we can get some comments from the audience about Where are you going for comfort in this very discomforting time? We got a bunch of quiet people tonight.
There are several reports from the Health Department, Human Services Studies Impact by Health. It's time to knock on those, dust off those reports. We have the research, United Nations report on health disparity. The World Health Organization prepared one as well. Can we get those?
Absolutely, we can get them, and we should also pay our dues to the World Health Organization so that they will have the resources they need to promote their own work. You know, politics gets involved in these issues. Some governors are reporting that they can't get the things that they need. We cannot let politics infect what we know is best practice, whether it's social distancing, whether it's doing the right kind of research with integrity. We cannot let politics sway what we know to be the facts. I want to go to our panelists. Do we have other questions, Mr. Johannes, now, or other comments?
Based upon your question, several people said that they find solace in their faith.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to express that to the rest of us? And you know, it's so unfortunate because now we can't go to church except virtually. Tomorrow morning, as a matter of fact, at 7 a.m., NCNW will host a prayer circle with Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, who is national chaplain for NCNW. A circle of women. I think we had about 129 women on the phone praying last Friday. And we'll do that every Friday morning at 7 a.m. from now until May 15th. Mr. JD.
Yes, I thank you. Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. I have a question, comment to make. It's something feeding me. What's feeding you? You hear feeding back?
A little bit, yes, sir. A little bit, yes, sir.
I don't know. Okay, where it's coming from. Okay, I was on the phone with a colleague from South Carolina yesterday, and he mentioned to me something that was very disturbing. JD, who's JD? My phone is off. Is your phone off? Is your phone off?
Let somebody up.
Well, you all go. Let someone, because we forgot what's feeding in. Okay. We forgot what's feeding in. Okay.
It's quiet now.
Well, I'll try it again.
Yes.
It was not me then. Okay. All right. So I was on the phone with a colleague from South Carolina yesterday, and this is down near Florence, South Carolina area. And what he mentioned to me was very disturbing. He said the African Americans are still holding church services in the midst of this pandemic. Someone please tell me why. And I thought about an old song that we used to sing when I was growing up, that quote unquote, Jesus is on the main line.
Tell him what you want.
Tell him what you want. Well, why do you have to assemble to do that? Why are we calling and doing virtual churches or some other means? Has the word got out yet to our communities? Now, we know we had a person down in Louisiana holding church for laying on hands, said he can't lay hands through the internet. But our faith, have we lost it and stepped out of reality, or waiting on God to come and spare us from this pandemic and still assembling? That is a concern. And I hope that is not broad spread across this country. It's in regards to African Americans. So this was just one incident that was shared. Do you want to hear from the audience or anyone? Is that going on in your community?
Yes, it is. I'll tell you, in our community, we actually had a funeral home and a church that decided to have a funeral, despite the fact that the local authorities had given a caution that no more than 10 people should join together. I think it's a matter of we're not taking it serious enough. In some places, you have large gatherings still going on. I'm in Tallahassee, Florida, and the report today in the news that the cops broke up 72 gatherings yesterday, parties, barbecues, football games. A lot of people are not taking it very serious, and it's a big issue. I have another issue though that I think is even greater. As you go outside, you see people in our community who are still working, workers at Walmart who are packaging groceries and taking them to the cars of people are not protected. People who are working drive-throughs, they're not protected. So I do think it's important that NCNW uses its platform to continue to call to these corporations who are continuing to allow and make people work, not properly protect them. And so I think there's still not enough seriousness on the part in our communities and not enough protection for the vulnerable people.
Thank you.
And just to
Go ahead, Robert.
oh, sorry. I said just to chime in shortly. I think also with the churches, one of the issues is we have to look at the economic aspect. The many churches survive on Bible study and the collection plate each week, and many pastors don't understand that they understand how they're going to keep the doors open without the money coming in each week. And I think it's important to educate them on some of the federal programs that are available to help support churches during this time and help them to understand that they can keep the doors open without putting at risk their congregation.
Thank you, Robert, because I was going to make that point. And with the CARES Act that was recently passed by Congress, my understanding is that not all churches, obviously, but those who have the ability are supposed to have access to those resources. I come out of Florida, and I know that I'm talking to my family, and I know a lot of churches are listening, but there are some that are not. And I think part of it, Dr. Cole and Janice, is to be able to and talk to find out how some of our denominations may need to deal with some mandates where there is the structure to do so that folks understand the severity. I was in Florida and Georgia for about 10 days earlier in the month. And because of the fact that in many of our states, especially in the South, where you have these governors who are playing games and still playing games, right? With the information, not all of our people are watching CNN, MSNBC, or even listening to our brother Roland on Roland Martin. They're not necessarily tuning in to get the information either. And so there is a concern. When I listen to the mayor of Chicago, who's been on quite a bit, that we've got to find ways to get information into our communities to really understand the severity of what's happening that has genocidal tendencies if we're not careful. Because we know it's not just age, we're dying across ages, people who had, I'm trying not to hyperventilate. I don't even like to get on Facebook, right now on social media, because you're hearing more and more of our people that are dying or that have this. And so we really got to find a way to get social media, but also working with Reverend Tony Lee, who happens to be my pastor, right? So I'm AME. So I'm just saying AME Church need to do something.
And you have the structure.
Right?
You made the point that the AME Church has the structure.
The mandate that my pastor is doing that over at Community of Hope, Chipper Hills, Maryland, right?
Right.
And they're putting church online. But some churches are also still having to find ways to put information out, help our folks who get food. Many of our communities are in food deserts, right? We're getting to a place where we're going to have to we're worrying about people didn't have access to food. So churches, in some cases, are still having to do ministry, if you will, outside of the wall and go out. Let's try to do it safely, but we've got to get it. So utilizing any avenues that we have. And I'm really, really concerned about the churches that are not following this and may not understand the severity at this point. So I'll stop there.
And I just want to go back to you all, because this is the meat of the discussion now that we are in, is that some of it is our own sort of skepticism and reticence about science. How can stand away from somebody, you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, What you mean I can't hug my sister-in-law or I can't go to church? That can't possibly make me sick. But just like we want this statistical information gathered about what makes us more susceptible to these ravaging disparities, we've got to accept too that science has something to teach us, and it is not anti-religious. Science is the answer to our prayer, not a substitute for it. And so I just think we need to pay attention to that a little bit too. We're sort of a little bit superstitious, you know, when it comes to, nobody's gonna tell me that I can't have a cookout in my backyard, that sort of thing.
Janice,
Let's go. Yes.
Janice, I think people should tell the story of what happened in Albany, Georgia. And for those people who read, you got to suggest that they must read the Atlanta Journal-Constitution article that properly chronicles what happened just from a simple funeral, how a whole clan of people, a whole city got sick, and all the deaths that came from just one funeral. I think that example alone, because everybody can relate to it, being an older person was in the hospital, we had a funeral, and all the people died, including the preacher. And so I think that brings it close to home, because for so many people, they can't relate to it being reality. We all can think of going to a funeral and relate to that. I think we got to some kind of way relate to it, because, you know, I'm sitting down in Florida, but when I talk to my family in New York, they tell me about what's happening to them, but it hasn't happened here. And so some people think because of the distance that they get concerned, but I would tell you personally, I got concerned when I saw it go to Albany, Georgia, then it got to Camilla, Georgia. I said, well, it's within 50 miles of me now. That's serious. So,
you make a great point, Darryl.
And on that same point, I think because in the beginning of the outbreak, the science wasn't explained to people. That's why it became so difficult for them to take it seriously, because it's not one of those, and this was The Walking Dead, and you have the exact same infection rate of zombies as you have with the coronavirus, then people would take that seriously if you just saw zombies walking down the street. But because you have 2 weeks of asymptomatics carrying where people do not know they're even sick, it makes it difficult for people to understand that, look, I'm fine, my family's fine, everybody looks happy, and then 3 weeks later, grandmama's dead. So I think we have to do a better public health advocacy to ensure that people understand exactly how the virus works. And even among our leadership, we saw a couple weeks after coronavirus got to America, you had Congressman Matt Gaetz wearing a gas mask on the floor of Congress, joking about the virus, and then he had to self-quarantine. You had major media figures saying that it was a hoax by the Democrats in order to make the president look bad. You had many people, including the mayor of New York, de Blasio, saying that it was just going to blow over and go away. So now, as that has trickled down, people are still not taking it seriously, and they won't take it seriously until, as Brother Darryl said, until it's at your front door. Once it's in your parlor, once it's in your own house, that's when people take it seriously. And we, as the people who do know, have to ensure that we translate that to people who may not have their finger on the pulse of the news media.
Well, that's why we here at the National Council of Negro Women are determined, and I know Black Women's Roundtable, we are determined that we're not going to rest with breath in our bodies until we help spread the word how serious this is. And Darryl, you made a good point that I want to go back to, which is, yes, some people have to be on the front lines of this pandemic. The nurses have to go, the doctors have to go, the EMT drivers have to go, but they do need the protection. They need the personal protective equipment in order to keep them as safe as they can possibly be. And that is something that we have also not done a very good job of doing. And we need to do more. And we need to think about World War II and what happened then when we started putting out planes and trucks and tanks and bombers, everything that was needed in order to protect ourselves from the Nazi threat. I see that Spencer Overton has joined us. Hey, Spencer, how are you? I hope that your camera, I know your camera's on. I hope your mic is unmuted. Spencer ran an op-ed in the Washington Post earlier this week. It seems like it might have been a month ago, but a very incisive piece that he wrote. Spencer is president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, a longstanding think tank which has really emerged as a thought leader in the Washington, D.C. and across the country. We want to welcome you, Spencer, and ask you, I don't know how much of this you've heard or whether you're ready to weigh in. If not, we'll come back to you in just a moment. I think Spencer's still trying to get unmuted. Let's go to our next slide and we'll come back to that. And that's one of the questions I want to pose to our panel. How do we message and work on these issues in ways that let our folk know exactly what the pandemic danger is? And yes, there is a role for personal responsibility, there's a role for corporate responsibility, but there's also a role for government responsibility. And that's what I would like for each of you to weigh in on, if you care to. What should the federal response be? We hear, well, we'll leave it up to the governors. Then another day you hear, well, we're at war. Which is it? Are we at war, or is every state at war on its own? These are the questions. And what should that federal response be? What's it going to look like 3 months, 6 months? I tell you this, the country was never the same after 9/11. We never went to the airport and got on an airplane the same way again after September 9/11. The world will never be the same after this either. It will change in many ways. And I think it's up to us, because we are the leaders that we're waiting on. It's up to us to decide what we want the world to look like post-pandemic. Mel, you look like you got a comment.
Just a quick one. One, I mentioned the CARES Act that was passed a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of folks are needing relief. So in the midst of trying to get us to understand the issues, there's the economic impact as well as the health impact. And so we want to make sure that our folks have that information. So from a federal level, and there's also another relief package being developed, and the unemployment impact is really, really critical. And access to healthcare, being able to try to get the federal government to do more in this next relief package that's being developed as we speak, around unemployment, around expansion of Medicaid, because in a lot of these states where we're talking about access to healthcare, those who are even trying to protect themselves or fear of going to the doctor because you don't have the resources is real. So being able to try to figure out how also make sure that the federal government does the right thing. I know last week we put out some information trying to make sure folks, and we know NCNW and Dr. Cole and Janice, you all do a great job with your entrepreneurship program. There's so many of our folks who work for themselves who don't have an income right now, right? Being able to make sure that they have that kind of information, what is available right now, and there's a lot of problems with it. But still, we telling everybody, apply, go and apply for the resources, and at least put your information in the system. And then advocate with your congressperson locally and your U.S. senator locally in your state to make sure to push them, because the whole term stimulus, I stopped using it because it's not. And I heard someone say that on the news. It said it's not stimulus; it's about relief right now, because we're still in the midst of it. It's not even recovery, because we're still in the midst of it, right? So the idea of stimulus makes it just sound like it's life and death, what we're talking about, and having that good information and being able to know what resources are there is really, really important.
Any other comments about what the government response should be? We've talked about what the emotional response, psychological. Robert, you've got a comment?
Yeah, I think on the governmental response level, we have to look at the way that we have to model it after things that have happened in other countries. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Taiwan, if you even look at China, their response was immediate and instant to the virus, because they better understood it. People have to understand that coronavirus is, though this is a novel strain, it's a cousin of the SARS virus, which was spreading in Southeast Asia in 2002 through 2004. So that SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the which causes COVID-19, they've been fighting this for 20 years, so they had a better idea of how to attack it. It's the SARS part is the Southern Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which means that the RNA in the virus attacks the alveoli in your lungs, which causes what's called a sciatic storm, where your immune system responds to the destruction of the alveoli by surging white blood cells to fight against that. That causes fluid to build up in your lungs. That causes the exhaustion of the immune system, which allows things like pneumonia and other bacterial infections and diseases to overwhelm the immune system. That's why the ventilator issue is so important, because the difference between the SARS virus from 20 years ago and the COVID-19 disease from now is that this attacks both your upper respiratory and the lower respiratory parts of your breathing apparatus, making it almost impossible for you to fight it off on your own without a ventilator if you have underlying health issues. Now think
Now,
about
Robert, let me interrupt you for just 1 minute. That was an impressive display of lay understanding of how SARS worked and what coronavirus is all about. And you're not trained as a doctor. And
I play one on TV.
I just have to say, you know, you're my protege and I love you like a son. But if you can understand it that well, surely there are people in the United States who didn't have to depend on people in East Asia to know that we were up against a pandemic.
Well, the problem was
I don't think we can let our government officials off the hook by saying they didn't understand it. Well, they understood what they wanted to understand.
Well, the issue was that people weighed the response that was needed versus the economic aspects of it, and what we're doing now, what we've seen with the flattening of the curve currently, is that the economic damage is worth it for the lessening in the loss of life. So what the government has to do is understand that we've had these statements: we're going to open back up by Easter, we're going to open up by the end of May. No, we're not. That's not how these things work. We've been talking about, well, there's these magical anti-malarial medications. That doesn't even make sense. The scientific evidence is not there to support it, and even the way the anti-malarials work are not how this virus would be treatment would happen. The government has to be honest with the American people. We are in for a long shutdown. We're going to have to do this for a while until it works through its own natural cycle, and then we'll be able to get back to business as usual. But if people start jumping the gun and we keep lying to people, saying we'll be back open in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, then that's just going to extend the pain and make it more difficult. So we have to have a government that's going to be honest with us and is willing to take the political blowback, because in an election year, it is hard to tell people you're going to be out of work for 6 months and we're going to do our best to keep things alive.
Hey, Janice, this
Yes,
is
Spencer.
Spencer. Hey, I just want to jump in. Thanks so much for including the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Certainly appreciate it. Dr. Cole, Daryl, Melanie, Robert, thanks so much. So I wanted to jump in and build on something Melanie was talking about in terms of, you know, we will see when Congress comes back around April 20th, some new activity in terms of legislation. And the question is, are we at the table, right? Like, there's certain things we can't control around us in terms of this virus. We can't control what's happening in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We can control what we do, though. Are we at the table when decisions are being made? This stuff happens so fast. The first 3 so-called stimulus bills, right, happened so fast, and so much money is allocated. And the question is, are we at the table? So some of the big issues will be, are we going to deal with some of the things that were left open before in terms of some of the economic issues? We're working on that. Jessica Fulton in our office is taking the lead on that. Another big issue we're going to see is going to be related to one of the big issues that Melanie, I know, deals with, is this vote by mail piece. And the vote by mail question really is vote by mail going to be accessible to Black people? If you look at vote by mail right now, Black folks are less likely to use vote by mail. The ballots that are turned in by Black voters are more likely to be rejected. And so what safeguards can be put in with regard to vote by mail, like prepaid postage, so you don't have to find a stamp? Like, okay, we're going to have a lot of people vote by mail, but there are going to be still some people who want to vote in person. How can we ensure they can vote and do so safely and not be in a long line next to somebody? here, right? So those voting issues, I
know
don't know.
Milwaukee showed that, right?
What's that, Melanie?
I said Milwaukee was an example.
Yeah, exactly. Milwaukee was
And
definitely an
and
example.
if we're not careful, we will see the use of coronavirus as an excuse to dampen democracy. There's some people that don't want everybody to vote. And so it'll be convenient to say, well, we can't do vote by mail, or we
Right.
can't do it well, or we have to
Right.
close all these polling places.
Right.
So I want to see what's going to happen in terms of safeguarding democracy as we go through this.
Well, what we've got to do is we got to allocate $2 billion to the states for voting. They only put in 400 million last time in terms of voting. And that money has to be for vote by mail, but good vote by mail that's accessible to Black people, as well as this safe in-person option, right, in terms of voting. There's some other big issues that I don't know that they're going to get in. This stuff is going to start on the House side. The House Dems will tee something up. I think that Speaker Pelosi is focusing on keeping it narrow. Like, she doesn't want it to be a Christmas tree bill. She doesn't want to be attacked by the Republicans that, hey, this is just a giveaway for Democratic interests, et cetera. So I think she's going to focus on relief for workers, for small businesses, keep it narrow. I think the voting piece maybe get in there. Unfortunately, I'm hearing that the infrastructure stuff, issues related to the digital divide, and so many of our kids who are not returning to school while other people are returning to school, unfortunately, I don't know that that's going to be in there toward the end of this month. We will see, however.
And I think that we are going to be facing challenges around food too, Spencer and Melanie, that the Farm Bill passed, but there are regulations that have constrained the way food aid is being generated. And there are likely to be food shortages as we move further and further away from stockpiles that have been gathered before. I am very afraid that we're going to have serious food insecurity coming out of this. Is there any talk about investment in making sure people don't go hungry during this pandemic?
You know, I have seen some relief. There are like three categories. One would be just straight aid. So even if you didn't have a job, straight aid here. How do we get you resources? And then how do we distribute, you know, aid to folks? Then workers who are laid off, who are furloughed, and then also the business piece. And the business piece is multiple layers. One would be small business generally. Another would be, I don't know that there was relief for landlords. We were trying to stop folks from getting evicted, which was certainly understandable. How do you ensure that their landlords can still pay their mortgages, or that their mortgage payments are forgiven or delayed there, right? And then these companies, in terms of, do they need some additional paycheck protection? I would agree with you in terms of basic structures, in terms of food distribution, et cetera. We've got to be concerned. I don't know that they have figured all that out. You remember the last bill was 800 pages, right?
Right.
So we're kind of targeting certain areas. The voting piece we're targeting, the benefits and kind of the economic piece we're targeting. Those are the places that we're targeting. Let me also just say this. If you go to joincenter.org, we've got a COVID page, and every week we basically send out all the news stories that are related to Black people and COVID-19. So we're really trying to track, you know, Black folks and policy, COVID-19, and put that all into one place for folks. So if you just go to joincenter.org, we got a COVID page, and you go there, and the stuff is laid out.
And it's very important that it's important for us to know who our elected officials are, but it's more important for them to know who we are. And you need to know not only who your members of Congress are during this period, but what committees are they on? Are any of them appropriators? Are any of them on ag? Are they on labor and education? Where are they serving? Because all of that matters as well. Thank you so much for raising those very important points. It's past 8 o'clock now, and I wanted us to think about, Dr. Fauci said earlier this week, well, there's nothing we can do about the health disparities. I disagree respectfully. You've just heard you can follow legislation on the Hill. You can check in with your state houses to find out how those budgets are being allocated as well, because I promise you the sausage is being made at the state and local levels, even as we speak. And Spencer, we're so grateful to you and Melanie and all of us who try to follow the federal legislation. But what about, Mel, in some of the localities? What are you hearing from some of your members who are in Alabama and Florida and South Carolina? I know you spend a lot of time on the ground with them.
Well, it's really mirroring what we're talking about here, access to healthcare. In the southern states, most of these southern states that have Republican, this is just factual, I'm nonpartisan, just factual, that they never adopted Medicaid expansion, right? You're talking about just having access to healthcare, which means the disparities were exacerbated by not having access to good healthcare. So in the midst of a pandemic, being able to try to figure out how to address that. I don't say that I know the answers, right? Because that's why I'm pushing when it comes to the federal legislation that could come down to the states, that the reason to be able for folks to have access to healthcare, whether you talk urban communities, and it's even more chronic in small town rural communities, just having access to healthcare. The other is the unemployment, and I know Spencer, you guys have those numbers and more data better than me, but the unemployment that's taking place, that they're saying it's a 10% unemployment. You know what it is for Black folks? And so not having access to unemployment benefits, so on a state level, on a local level, really working for folks to have access to healthcare and funding, so that if you can pay for the food for yourself, or you're gonna have to find ways for our civic community to find ways to help deal with realities that our folks are gonna be out here not having food. I mentioned earlier that I didn't finish the fact that what Reverend Tony, and not just because he's my pastor, but just because he's doing something that's really critical for Easter. Can't have church, but there's a lot of folks who are doing these kind of like drive-by testing kind of models to even deal with giving folks food. So on Easter Sunday, for 2 or 3 hours, going to give away food and do that in a safe distance way, so that folks can have access to nutrition. So, and we talk about exacerbating the situation, and folks are going to do what they got to do to feed their families. And so that means the kind of behaviors that can be, Daryl, I would say you would have a better description of that than me, even in the reality of what can happen when our folks don't take care of their families and find a way to feed their families. So those are the things that I'm hearing from folks, and that concern, and then just having a concern about how to stay safe. Just the basics and the anxiety. So when you talked about coping, just figure out how to cope. Make sure our children are not stimulated by all of what's going around them, and so much that we don't know about this, and being able to check in, find ways to check in with each other and check on each other. Old-fashioned stuff that we used to do has to be done in whatever safe way we can do it, but that's part of it too, because people are going to getting depressed and feeling of hopelessness. That's what
I'll tell you what I'm concerned about. I think many of the local and state officials are getting it right with the messaging that they're doing. The problem is our president in the last hour goes and has a press conference, and his main thing is opening the economy, when we all know that there's great depth going on in up north and down south, and he's predicting that it's going to last for the next 2 months. Yet the message is not the same, and so people are confused and conflicted when they're hearing about all the depth, following the rules and distancing. Yet this other guy is talking about, hey, we got to start this economy. So a lot of confusion there. A lot of confusion. Yeah. I think history will really reflect that.
And just to on the stimulus aspect, because we've been diving in deep with this with small business owners and also clergy for the last couple of weeks, the problem that we had in stimulus pack 3 that has to be remedied in stimulus pack 4 is that for poor people, for the rank and file, for working people, we have big chunks of this government that still believe in Milton Friedman, that still believe in the Austrian school or the Chicago school of austerity. You just want to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You need to work for what you get. You should have saved some money. You should have a 6-month supply put away, and it's your fault that you're broke right now. But when it comes to the top of the economy, to the deltas, to the airline industry, to the cruise industry, they go straight Keynesian economics. We have to have the direct injection of economic capital to keep these businesses afloat, so that they're able to stimulate the economy and make sure that they stay in business. That is just simply put nonsense. That's not how things work. In the Keynesian model, it doesn't matter how you inject money into the economy as long as that money is put into the economy. You could drive an airplane coast to coast and just throw bags of money out as long as you're putting money into the economy. It's a stabilizing force. Is what the IMF has been doing since post-World War II. You can look at the Marshall Plan as an example of that. So the fact that this bill ended up being 800 pages is all waste, fraud, abuse, and pork and special interest groups getting what they need out of it because they really wanted to stimulate the economy. They could have went to the IRS, opened up everybody's account, typed in $1,000, hit enter, and then went home for the rest of the night. So we have to watch over what they're doing in Washington and not let these omnibus bills, these massive spending bills, reshape the way our economy is made and not put that money into the pockets of the people who need it.
Janice, I just want to make a couple quick points here. One, to build on Melanie's point about unemployment. You all know that last week we had 6.6 million unemployment claims. And before COVID started, the highest week ever had been about 700,000. So that just spiked almost 10 times as much in terms of just 1 week here, in terms of the highest week. It's massive in terms of this change and what's happening. Now, in terms of your members, right? Like we are frankly, the folks who are on this call are privileged, and we got to just be rots. We got to be active. We got to like hold these politicians accountable and follow them in terms of what we're doing. We need them. It's not like just somebody in Washington, D.C. is monitoring all this and can control it all, right? Like we're doing our best as the Black think tank.
The lobbyists are all on the other side.
Yeah, exactly. So we need folks who are at home, who are paying attention to what their members doing, who are engaged, etc. There are, and I agree with you, there are problems in terms of leadership in this country. I agree with you in terms of all that. But again, in terms of what we can control what we're monitoring. We can control if we're engaged, if we're active, if we're calling these members, if we're following this stuff. So none of us can do it all, but we all have our part in terms of monitoring our particular member, what's happening at the local level, the state level, the federal level. And, you know, you all are just so important. And we just need folks to step up to the plate and recognize their value and their voice and the importance of being engaged and being activists here. That's going to make all the difference in terms of our community.
I agree. Let's, if there's a burning comment, I want to take it now, but I do want to give the audience a chance to pose a few questions if they have any at this point. It's about 8:15. We've got about 15 minutes.
Edna Kane Williams said, thank you for an informative session.
Edna Kane Williams from AARP, one of the angels of the earth. We appreciate you, Edna, and what AARP stands for. NCNW has, over the past several years, attempted to sort of stake out a bulkhead in the agriculture department because that's where the food aid comes from. And we've been closely following what's been done with the Farm Bill and with the regulations that followed, and now with stimulus elements. So many children in this country get their main 2 meals a day from school. And so when school is closed, there's no breakfast and there's no lunch. Now, many school districts, and there is funding for it, but how is it being delivered? Is it being done fairly and equitably? Is it going to all neighborhoods? There are still issues to be determine there. Of course, our good friend Marsha Fudge is on the Ag Committee, and we depend on her for that information coming out of that committee. But Spencer, you are right. This is the time for those of us who have the luxury of working from home on computers to make sure that we're not just chatting up each other on Facebook and Instagram, but that we are following closely the deliberations of the Congress and of the state houses. I really wish that some of that money wouldn't go so much to the states as it would go to some of our cities. If you look at who's running the cities now and where the most need is, there's a case to be made for direct aid to cities in addition to aid to states. Of course, that's not the way our government generally is organized. Are there, Mr. Johannes, are there any questions from the audience as we near a conclusion?
Do you think the Surgeon General should have more of a part in this?
Any opinions about the Surgeon General's role? I think he's attempted to be forthright. I'm not familiar with him really and don't have anything. Anybody?
I think he's at a disadvantage. I mean, like everyone that works with this administration, they could get up and say what they believe to be the truth, and he gets up and says what he wants to say, and it's totally inconsistent.
You can tell which one of us does not work for a 501c3 organization.
We are nonpartisan, non-biased.
Are there any other
I'm
questions?
private.
Ask the person in the audience, what do they think the Surgeon General's role should be?
Okay, they just heard you on that. A lot of comments. Government officials have to listen to the scientists and those in medicine.
Okay. Well, I want to do a lightning round of our guests here tonight. I want you to each give me 3 specific, detail-oriented things that we can do when we leave this webinar tonight that might make a difference. What can we do now? We're conscious, we're woke. What is it that we ought to be doing? Now, I gave you sort of my pick-to-click list, but I want to hear what yours is because we want to leave here sort of with a game plan.
Well, I'll hop in because
Robert, start with you.
If you leave a void, I'm going to talk.
That's right.
But we have to look at the 3 factors that have led to the African American community being disproportionately represented in the deaths in the coronavirus outbreak. You have the social aspects, the economic aspects, and the systemic aspects. Social aspects being that we lack access to healthcare. There aren't many hospitals in our communities. We have a social structure which tells us we are immune to many diseases when we really aren't. And because of that, we have a lot of festering underlying conditions that the left is susceptible to this. Economically, we are those frontline workers. We are those essential workers. Many of us are not able to work from home. We are exposed in our communities, and therefore we got transmitted the virus far more rapidly than other communities. And because of these social aspects, we were not able to get the care that we needed. And we can't really self-quarantine when you make minimum wage. You can't take 14 days off work in order to not spread the virus. And finally, systemically, we have to talk about access to healthcare. We have to talk about access to transportation. We have to talk about the fact that so many people live in red line communities and slums and public housing where you are so packed in with 6 or 8 people in a house. Of course, you're not the virus is going to spread faster than that. So once we address the social, economic, and the systemic issues, that will inoculate us in the future from the next virus because there's always a next virus.
Okay.
So I know, Janice, you have a lot of membership organizations. And so your membership organizations, the local chapters, here's what I would suggest they do. 3 things, right?
Right.
One thing is so put together a committee that focuses on COVID. Focus on 3 things. 1, figure out what block grants are coming to your state and where they are going. You talked about money coming in from the federal government, going to the state government. Often that money does not get to our communities. It may go to the communities that are the political supporters of a governor, but they're not coming to our communities. So tracking that money and understanding that, that's one job of this committee of the local chapter. Number 2, figuring out who's your local member in the state house and in Congress, you know, in terms of Senate, what committees are they on? And the committees that they are on, how it relates to COVID-19 and Black folks. And you will have so much influence over that because you're their constituent. And they don't want any problems at home. And if you're paying attention to that issue as it affects Black folks in the country, you're going to have so much influence in terms of both your district and area, but then also Black folks across the nation. And then the third thing, you know, I got to self-promote a little bit. You go to jointcenter.org, just follow the news in terms of what's going on, in terms of our updates, in terms of COVID-19 and Black communities. So those are three big things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Melanie?
Okay. I'm going to say ditto with all of our colleagues here. And then one thing to do is check on somebody. You know, we got to, because we're getting on to what now, going into another month, that could go into another month. And so to deal with coping, let's also check on each other more regularly. You know, pick up the phone. Don't just do social media. Pick up the phone. Can't, you know, wave at your neighbor if you can't talk. But just deal with the human side, humanity side of this thing. Just to deal with the wellness. I think the issue of mental health is we didn't really get a chance to talk about that. But being able to cope is just check on each other. Mm-hmm. So whether that be through your member or organizations, through your family and the like, check on each other. Because as this thing is entering our psyche, healing and closer and closer, than we all, I know somebody, and I probably everybody on this call, this here on this say, no, if you don't know somebody who died, I know somebody who knows somebody who died and already buried a family member. Yeah. From this, and so the realities of it is real. So that's a big part. I'm going to reiterate. Make sure you know where the resources are for yourself, for your family, for your community, and push, especially on a local level. Push again, support your elected officials. Again, push them. And my fourth, I mean, I don't know if that was 2 or 3. I'm missing another count. Is make sure you vote.
Vote.
Make sure you vote.
And fill out the census if you haven't done it already.
Yeah, and do it as safely as you can. But I do know that there are people who are using this and are already planning to use this for November. So that we know the jig is up and the game is real. And so we have to do everything we can to figure out how we're not going to let folks take our vote. And we're going to make the changes and shift power in a way, nonpartisanly speaking, lawyers, to make sure that this pandemic will not take our race out. And that's really what's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
Any other?
Yeah. Without question, you know, one thing we didn't mention on here, I think planning financially is so important. For example, in most situations, most folks got to know that almost all mortgage companies and banks are deferring loans. And so for people who haven't taken advantage of that, they need to call and ask for that and buy those 3 months, because we don't know where this is going. Number 2, I'm really concerned about, from an educational standpoint, the effect that it's going to have on children within our community. I really fear them being left behind because they may not have access not to just high speed, but to the laptops that you want them to have to do the work as well. And thirdly, I just think about what I've seen in the last week in my community when I see these service workers, brothers and sisters who are on the line working in drive-throughs and working for these companies and they're not being protected. I think they're taking serious risks they shouldn't take, and it's obvious that someone doesn't really care about them. And I think it's a big issue as to why it's spreading so much in our community. Thank you.
Okay, all of those are great ideas. I appreciate each one of you. We're going to visit the jointcenter.org and follow Spencer's. I'm going to create those committees. I've already got one in Kentucky. You might imagine why. But we're going to follow this legislation. We're going to vote. We're going to advocate for health care. We're going to make sure that we do what we need to do to protect ourselves and our neighbors. I want to thank each and every one of you. We've got time maybe for one final question from the audience, if there is one. If not, thank you all and good night and stay
Yeah.
healthy.
And
I
stay
love
safe.
you guys. Thank you.
Be safe. Thank you,
Be
Janice.
safe.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Janice.
you. Thanks so
All right.
much.
Good night, everybody.
All right, Janice.